Hope you have been enjoying the courses so far. It's me again, Yvonne, the Senior Operations Manager from Explore. Welcome to Course 3. In the last course, we have already introduced you to our first steps of risk management. In this, we covered putting together a risk assessment. So by this point, you should have identified all of your risks. In this course, we will be going over the more detailed checks that are sometimes necessary. We call these standard operating procedures. These are best described as very detailed set of rules and procedures that we require our extended suppliers to complete and comply to before we will use them. There are several layers of responsibility with standard operating procedures. Explore is the international tour operator. We have contracts in each country with what is the national tour operator, like yourselves, who in turn have contracts with extended suppliers, such as local guides, accommodation, and transport. Part of our contract with the national tour operator is that we require these extended suppliers to comply to these procedures. We require that the national tour operator or the extended supplier complete and return these forms. We also require that they comply to all of the guidelines and rules within them. A breach of these rules and procedures would therefore be considered a breach of contract. So why are standard operating procedures so important? In short, to keep our customers safe, to keep our crew safe, to reduce the number of accidents and incidents we have, to improve the quality and the safety on our tours, to protect Explore and the national tour operator's reputation, and to prove to our public liability insurance that we are doing everything in our control to keep our customers safe. Margaret will run through public liability in more detail in Course 5. So why should a supplier fill them in? Our public liability insurance requires us to have these checks in place. What if a supplier does not wish to complete it? Simply, if they do not complete it, we will not use them. What if a supplier does complete it, however does not comply on one of the risk factors? We may try to put a control measure in place. However, if this is not possible, we may then look for another supplier who does comply. So what does the national tour operator and Explorer gain from having these documents filled in? We can ensure that all of our services are being checked and expected to be of the same high level of safety and quality throughout the world. We also feel assured that we have done all the possible checks to ensure that our customers are in a safe place, using safe services, and in the hands of a professional crew. If the rules on these standard operating procedures are not followed, the national tour operators, extended suppliers, must be aware if there is any negligence to comply to these guidelines, that this could result in themselves, the guide, or Explorer, therefore being liable. In this slide, I'm going to run through Explorer's risk management system, of which risk assessments and standard operating procedures are part of. Here at Explorer, we have a vehicle standard operating procedure. This is a detailed checklist with rules and guidelines on how to operate vehicles safely. We require this for all of the vehicles we have contracted to us. We also have an accommodation standard operating procedure, likewise a same checklist for all the accommodation we stay in. We also do this for camping for our groups. With vessels and boats, we do have a safety system in place where we require that every boat be checked that goes half a mile offshore and every boat that we sleep in. With Explore leaders, we have a detailed checklist between us and the national tour operator to make sure that all of our leaders are adequately prepared and trained before going out to lead trips for us. And finally, we have the activity standard operating procedures, a detailed checklist and guideline for all of the activities we have on our trips. All of these procedures are culminated into what we call our risk management system, and they're all written down in what we know here as the Risk Management Manual. So where is the national tour operator's responsibility? Explorer have all of these standard operating procedures in place. It is the national tour operator's responsibility to make sure that they have been completed and that compliance has been signed off. It is also their responsibility to make sure that this is communicated and distributed to all the relevant staff involved in the risk management system of your company. It is also down to them to make sure that the extended supplier have completed all these documents and that they do comply. In some cases, the national tour operator will have to enforce compliance to these guidelines. This may be done through drivers, guides, or other members of staff. In the cases that there is a non-compliance to these actual procedures, make sure that they have a plan in place to reduce or remove the risk. And it is also the national tour operator's responsibility to make sure these are kept up to date. We renew them between every 1 to 3 years. Where there has been a non-compliance accepted, as I mentioned, there may be some guidelines in place to reduce or remove the risk. Here's an example. In accommodation, there is only one fire exit, one staircase out of the building. So this is a non-compliance. If this is the case, we require our tour leaders to monitor that this always remains free from blockage, and we also require that they are briefed on the evacuation plan. Likewise, before departure, a full briefing is given by the crew or hotel staff on fire procedures. In this case, they non-complied. So in this case, we put a control measure in place where the leader would give the full briefing as per the safety manual. As in every risk assessment, things change. Risk assessments are involving the study at the time that you are doing it. However, new risks may arise. Make sure you keep all of these documents up to date. It is worth considering doing high risk checks at least every year. What we're going to look at now is a practical example of a standard operating procedure. We're going to look at an example of a vehicle. There are 3 stages to every standard operating procedure. The first one are the checks. Make sure that all the checks are done. The second stage is briefing the customers. And the third stage is reporting back. I will run through these in the next 3 slides. In this slide, we're looking at checks. As you can see with transport, there are 2 checks to be made. You want to check the vehicle itself, and you also want to check that the driver is okay and ready to take the journey. We do not expect the guides to be mechanics. However, in this standard operating procedure, these are visual checks that can be made just by looking at the vehicle. If there is any non-compliance, so an N in the comply column, there must be a control measure in place. This could be something like the tour leader taking action, or the tour leader taking the group around the vehicle and showing them the risk. This could also involve obtaining new equipment. There must be a control measure in place for every non-compliance. So for example, all seat belts are in good working order. If that's a yes, you go on to the next check. If that's a no, we have to have a control measure in place. The control measure in this case would be get new seat belts, or the control measure may also involve replacing the vehicle. In this slide, I'll be referring to the second stage of the standard operating procedure. So this is the briefing stage. This could be the guide's responsibility, or it could be the driver's responsibility if he speaks the same language as the customers. However, between the 2 of them, they must give a safety brief on the risk aspects about the vehicle they're about to board. Here is a list of important safety information that needs to be handed over to the customer. As above, if there is any non-compliance or any breach in this brief, in the non-compliance column, there has to be a control measure in place. If there is no control measure in place and it is non-compliant, make sure you discuss this with the national tour operator or with Explorer, as we may have to consider changing the vehicle. And then finally, there's the third stage of standard operating procedures, which is reporting back. Are there any issues with the vehicle? Were there any incidents with the vehicle? If so, please make sure that this is handed back to the national tour operator and explorer to investigate and to either put control measures in place or, as mentioned earlier, the potential changing of the vehicle. As part of a vehicle standard operating procedure, there are also extra guidelines in place for the driver and the transport company. The following is a list of more technical checks that must be done by the driver before departure on every day of the trip. It will be worth the guide or the tour leader also walking around the vehicle, doing these checks with them, making sure that they are being done. These checks would include fluids. Are they all topped up? Fuel. Is there enough fuel for the day? If they are going to have to fill up en route, make sure the customers are off the bus in the fueling station. Filters. Are they cleared? Tyres. Are they legal? Battery. Is it charged and ready for today's trip? Are the lights and the electrics working? Is the windscreen clear of cracks? Are there seatbelts present and in working order? Is the interior clean and tidy? Are the wheel nuts all present or have they been sheared off? And finally, with off-road vehicles, there are sometimes extra safety checks, such as does it have 2 spare tyres and does it have the vehicle jack and the wheel brace that are necessary for changing in remote areas. In the last 3 slides, I have covered what we would consider a complete vehicle standard operating procedure. As you can see, the national tour operator has a responsibility to complete this, which is contractually binding to Explorer. However, the responsibility also lies with the guide, the drivers and the transport company to make sure that this standard operating procedure is being complied to. As well as transport, we also have the standard operating procedure for accommodation, and what we will run through now is the guide's guidelines for this. As you can see, the same 3 stages, starting with the checks, then following on with the necessary briefs that have to be considered, and then the reporting back of any incidents or any safety issues. And again, make sure that they are compliant. If there are any N's in the compliance column, make sure that there is a control measure in place. So it's down to the guide to make sure the fire exits are clear of obstructions. Make sure the fire exits are clearly marked. Make sure that fire extinguishers are present on all floors. These are visual checks that you can make. If the fire exits, for example, are not clearly marked and there's an N in the compliance column, we can report this to hotel management. We can put up signs. Some of these procedures are very cheap and very straightforward to put in place, and always remember all of these checks and all these safety control measures that we put in place will save lives. If there is any non-compliance and there is no control measure in place, please remember you must discuss this with the national tour operator and or explorer in order to get their assistance to make the control measures or to change accommodation. As well as accommodation, transport and boats, we also have standard operating procedure for several of the activities that we do. This is often the guide's responsibility to make sure that the checks, the briefs and the reporting are done. So here we have an example of the checks before going out on a walk. This is the guide's responsibility. Make sure that they're carrying all the necessary safety equipment as well as the first aid kit. Make sure that they know that where all the nearest medical facilities are should there be an accident. Check that the customers have the correct footwear for the walk. Check that the customers are fit and physically ready for this walk. Make sure that they have walked the walk before and they're not doing it for the first time with a group. Check the weather forecast that morning. Monitor customers' behaviour throughout the walk. Make sure that they are all well physically. If pack animals or porters are being used on this trek, make sure that they are all healthy, they're not overloaded and taken care of. So these are the sort of checks that you may have to do when taking a group out on a walk. It is also the guide's responsibility to brief the group on the walk for the day. They will need to cover equipment necessary for the walk. They will also need to cover on a back marker system on how the group is kept together during the walk. Potential dangers would need to be covered, such as steep drops and steep gradients. You will need to run through the schedule of the day, including breaks, where they'll be having lunch, and also toilet breaks. Make sure all the customers have adequate rests throughout the walk. And if there are any risks or exposure en route, make sure you brief on those as well. It is the guide's responsibility to take any actions should anything go wrong. So the more detail in the brief, the more you are ready for this walk. Wild animals and dogs can often interfere with walks. Brief the customers to stay away from them. There may be river crossings. You may have to brief them on how to safely cross. We try not to walk at night. However, if it has been agreed, make sure that the customers are carrying torches. If you're trekking at high altitude, there may be extra questions and points to cover on a safety briefing for that sort of trek. And then finally comes the last stage, which is the reporting back. As we've mentioned, even with risk assessments and standard operating procedures, sometimes there are still incidents. So what you want to do is report any incidents back to the national tour operator and to Explore. However, you also want to report back any safety concerns, any safety issues you came across on that day's walk. By not reporting back and no one being aware of it, there will be no plan in place and it may happen again. So reporting back is a very important part of a standard operating procedure. In summary, what we have covered in the last two courses is the risk assessments and the standard operating procedures that Explore have in place. Through having both of these in place, we have made sure that we work only with qualified and competent staff. We have checked compliance by national law with all of our services and activities. We have checked they have all the legally required documentation, and we have checked that they have all the necessary first aid and safety equipment. Also through these, we make sure all the pre-safety checks are done and that detailed safety briefs are being given either by the crew, the staff, or the guides on the ground. All of the tour operators, guides and drivers and extended suppliers that Explore work with must be familiar with all of our guidelines and rules. They must also comply to them in order to work for Explore. In the next course, you will be covering the next section of risk management. As we know, with all of these checks in place and with all of the documents in place, accidents still happen and you have to be prepared. We will be discussing how to put together an emergency preparedness plan.